Dutch? Okay.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from my time zone here in Toronto, Canada. My name is Nekme Obasogie. I'm the moderator of today's program. Today's program is actually a part of our efforts to promote the Benin history and culture in diaspora. It focuses on overseeing the trend and research done by some private and academic researchers on Benin artifacts, how these artifacts were disseminated across the globe, the return, compensation, and more. From our findings thus far, most of the research and information about Benin artifacts are accessible to a few Edo citizens worldwide. There is a need to utilize an Edo-oriented platform such as Nebo TV and others to educate and update a vast majority of Edo citizens about the latest news regarding the whereabouts and return of these artifacts. Our facilitator of today's program is an author, former correspondent at BBC and Al Jazeera. Mr. Barnaby Phillips is here to present a topic titled The Restitution of Benin Artifacts. We have 9 panelists on today's program. Professor Esoe Messi Omoregbe from the Department of Linguistic Studies, University of Benin. Barrister N.Y. Fred Ogeriahi from Ireland. Professor Aliles Igbineweka from California, United States. Chief Efosa Samson Ezoba from New York. Dr. Mrs. Gladys Ameze Ihimi, Associate Professor at the University of Benin. Dr. Patricia E. Fadaka Ignovia, she's joining us today from New York. Mr. Michael Ode, President of BACO, is joining us from Germany. Mr. Sunday Okoro from Hartford, Connecticut, and Professor Victor Edosa Omozuwa from the Department of Linguistic Studies, University of Benin. I welcome you all to today's program. Thank you all for taking your time to join to this seminar. I will say, for those who are watching from Facebook and YouTube, please leave your question in the comments section. We're going to be taking questions from Facebook and YouTube. Without wasting your time, I'm going to call on our facilitator today, Mr. Barnaby Phillips, to take the floor. Hello, sir.
Hello, Nekpem. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to speak to you and to speak to the Edo diaspora and Edo people back in Nigeria today. And I do so in a very humble spirit. And I should just explain the parameters of my talk and indeed my book, Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes, because some of you may well be thinking, you know, why have we got this Oyibo on today who's telling us about our culture? What does he know? And so I think I should explain that I'm very aware of my own limitations in this regard. I'm not an expert on the Edo language or on Edo culture. I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnographer. I'm a historian and a journalist. And I felt that I could write a political history of the Benin Bronzes. I emphasize political, and specifically the way in which Europe and above all my own country Britain interacted with that history, because for better or indeed we might well say for worse, Europe and Britain are a big part of that history of the Bronzes. And I also felt that I hoped I could act as something of a bridge in this debate. I am British, it is my country, it is my culture, but I've lived for much of my life as a reporter in sub-Saharan Africa, including 3 years in Nigeria. And so I felt in my own humble way, perhaps I could explain to a Nigerian audience or have some aspects of British history and culture. I would have access to British institutions like the British Museum, access to British libraries that wouldn't be so easy for people in Nigeria. And of course, I could explain to a British audience what people were thinking in Nigeria, what Edo people were thinking. The Benin Bronzes, from Africa to Britain and back again. The question mark at the end implies that something is changing, that things are moving. We are having debates about empire, colonialism, and race here in Britain and the West that we were not having 10, or I would suggest even 5 years ago. And I believe that the Benin bronzes are at the heart of this debate. In fact, they've become emblematic of one particular aspect of it, which is what should we do with colonial era looted objects in our museums? And why have the Benin bronzes become emblematic of it? I would suggest two reasons. They are amongst Africa's greatest treasures, its most beautiful treasures. And secondly, the way in which they were taken right at the very end of the scramble for Africa is so well documented, indeed photographed from the British side. It was particularly shocking, particularly egregious, and perhaps that's why they've attracted so much attention. Look at these two fabulous pieces. You'll be very familiar with them, of course. They're both in the British Museum. When we see the cast on the left, we believe Queen Idia from the 15th century. When Ormond Dalton, a distinguished British Museum curator, saw it in 1897, he said, "as if from ancient Greece." The mask on the right, also we believe Queen Idia, well, it needs no introduction. It's famous in Nigeria, of course, as the Festac mask. And when the British Museum finally acquired it in 1909, some 12 years after the expedition, they were delighted. They believed that they had the single greatest treasure which had come out of Benin. The Benin Kingdom, well, this is its probable extent in the late 19th century. You can see the shaded area. Of course, you'll know the geography much better than me. And it also is worth noting as well that if this map had been drawn, let's say 300 or 400 years earlier, that shaded area, the Benin Kingdom, the Benin Empire, would have extended considerably further to the west into what is today perhaps the Republic of Benin, and further to the east as well, up to the River Niger. I think it's fair to say that by the late 19th century, the power of the Benin Kingdom had waned somewhat. What do Europeans know about the Benin Kingdom? This is a famous picture. You may well have seen it by the Dutch geographer Alfred Dapper, and it dates from the late 17th century. And I think to many people, it captures the essence of pre-colonial African greatness. There was a British historian, some of you might have heard of him, Hugh Trevor Roper. He was at my university, Oxford, and he famously wrote that pre-colonial African history was nothing more, I quote, than the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes. And yet this picture seems to suggest something very different. We see a king on horseback. We see that he's surrounded by dwarfs and musicians. We see chained leopards, all symbolic of his power. We get a sense of military prowess in the procession that's coming out of the walled city behind him. We see splendid buildings. All of this suggests something rather different than what Hugh Trevor Roper was saying. Now, I think there are one or two reasons we have to take Alfred Dapper, the illustrator, with a degree of skepticism. He never traveled to Benin himself. He shows it, for example, as being surrounded by hills, and those hills aren't necessarily there. So we can't take him as an absolutely reliable witness. But on the whole, what he's showing here is absolutely consistent with the reports that were coming from the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and the French over some 400 years of peaceful interactions between Europe and the Benin Kingdom. Of course, it was the Portuguese who got there first. They had the most enduring influence, I would suggest. They bring guns, they trade ambassadors with the Benin Kingdom. They bring brass manillas, heavy bracelets, which are a catalyst for the further production of the Benin bronzes. They're melted down by the metal casters who work for the Oba. The Portuguese are interested in pepper, they're interested in ivory, they're interested in slaves. They send missionaries, they leave a legacy in language. When the great Victorian British explorer, by then he was a colonial official, Richard Burton, visits Benin in the 1860s, he says that in the court, they are speaking a bastardized form of a Lusitanian language, Lusitania meaning Portugal and Spain and that part of Europe. Burton's visit, incidentally, comes at a time of hardening attitudes towards Benin from the British. By the 19th century, it is the British who are very much in the ascendancy on the West African coast. They've established a protectorate along the coastline of the Niger Delta. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French have all faded away by now. Of course, the British had been very enthusiastic slavers in the 18th century. By the 19th century, they're no longer interested in slaves. They're actually quite zealously anti-slavery. They want rubber, but above all, they want palm oil, which is the lubricant for the new machines of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And with that greater commercial drive that is characteristic of the Victorian era comes a greater moral zeal, I would say. Slavery, human sacrifice in Benin become subjects of morbid fascination and fierce moral condemnation. And by the late 19th century, some traders from Liverpool and Glasgow are saying, the Oba has to go. He is an obstacle to British trade, and they are agitating for an armed takeover. The British government on the whole is not interested. It will be very expensive. It will be a cost in lives. West Africa is still the white man's grave in the eyes of the British government. Europeans still haven't made the connection, in fact, between mosquitoes and malaria. They don't do that, ironically, until a few months after the Benin expedition itself. But that British reluctance to get involved changes with the fateful events of January 1897, which I don't think need much introduction to anybody on this call. This is the grave for 7 Englishmen. I took this picture in 2019. You'll know it well in the village of Ubeni. This is where I now tell you that I am not related to Vice Consul James Phillips in any way, because I always get asked this whenever I meet an Edo person. So please bear that in mind. His exact motives in January 1897 do remain mysterious, I believe. Yes, he's agitating for an armed takeover of the Benin Empire. The documentation is there. Edo historians like Philippe Igbafe have shown this very clearly. He takes a large expedition with him. He doesn't wait for permission from his masters in London, and his men are not armed. And it's very difficult to get into his exact mentality. My own belief, for what it's worth, is I think he thinks one of 2 things will happen to him. Either the Oba of Aranwell will greet him and will be in some ways coerced into re-acknowledging the treaty that had been signed back in 1892 with Henry Galway, and that will be a boost for James Phillips, who's an ambitious young official, or he will be turned away by the Edo, and in that way he will have the justification to agitate for the armed invasion which he is in favor of. Of course, a third thing happens, which is that he is ambushed by the Oba's soldiers. They are easy targets as they march in single file through the dense forest. And these deaths cause a great shock. Remember, this is 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, the very height of British imperial hubris. And the events are given a gruesome color and poignancy by the 2 British survivors who stagger through the bush for days afterwards. In fact, we also know that there's actually a lot of confusion on the Oba's side, a lot of panic over what the British motives are. They've seen how ruthlessly other chiefs and kings have been dealt with in the Niger Delta. But I think the point is that from this point on, the British invasion is inevitable. British honor is at stake. The Oba must be punished. Lord Salisbury agrees. The German newspapers, don't forget the aspect of inter-European rivalry, are crowing about the English defeat at Benin. And so the punitive expedition is dispatched. Here they are, senior officers on the boat, the Bathurst in Liverpool, about to set off to avenge Phillips's death. Ralph Moore, the senior colonial official, a shadowy figure, I try to go into his motives. He's seated in the middle. Immediately behind him, in the checkered cap, is a man called Captain Herbert Walker. Bear his name in mind, because I'm going to bring him up later. I would say the man with the moustache, but that won't narrow it down very much, I'm afraid. And on the right, one of the tall men, third from the right, is Bruce Hamilton, who will be put in charge of the land forces, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hamilton, later notoriously dubbed Brute Hamilton for his role in the South African War of 1899 to 1902, and his role in putting Afrikaner women and children in concentration camps. But overall command goes to this man, Admiral Sahari Rawson. For those of you who know London, if you've been down to St. Paul's Cathedral, and if you've ever seen Lord Nelson's tomb in the crypt there, a great British naval hero, well, you'll find a plaque to Admiral Harry Rawson, just a stone's throw away from Lord Nelson. He's a man like many of his officer class. He's been at sea since he was a teenager, took part in the sacking of the Emperor's Palace at Peking in the 1850s, and a whole string of little colonial imperial wars, what Rudyard Kipling called the savage wars of peace that today we barely remember, Zanzibar, Mweli. The speed of the British response is very impressive. Britain is, of course, the leading imperial power. Troops and sailors are assembled from Malta, from Cape Town. They have the Maxim gun, which is an absolutely devastating weapon. It fires 10 bullets a second. They have rockets. And even though the Edo resistance is fierce, and the British also suffer from malaria and water shortages, the fact that they were ultimately going to prevail, I believe, was never in doubt. And they take Benin City only 5 weeks after Phillips was killed. And maybe this would be another forgotten imperial war from the British point of view, if not for this. They, quotes, discover the Benin bronzes in the Oba's palace, the heritage of hundreds of years, a regular harvest of loot, says Henry Galway, I believe, in his diary. It's not quite a free-for-all. The senior officers get first pick. But what you are seeing here, of course, and you don't need me to tell you this, is the careless dismantling of a culture. Remember, in the West today, we might think of the Benin bronzes as art, objects we admire aesthetically in a museum. But of course, to the Edo, they are spiritual, they are records of history. So maybe we should see these images not only as the ransacking of a palace, but as the plunder of a cathedral, the pillaging of a national library. Here's the London Daily Graphic. The King's house is rather a marvel, is the caption at the bottom. This process goes on for several days. The loot is loaded onto donkeys. We believe this one belonged to a famous war correspondent, Seppings Wright. And he turns up a few days after Admiral Harry Rawson has taken Benin City. And he brings with him champagne and cigars and whiskey and claret and blankets and folding chairs. And in return, he's given an extraordinary amount of loot. And he writes a series of very influential articles for the Illustrated London News, which portray Benin as a place of barbarism and savagery, the city of blood. And his articles are very powerful. And of course, here is Oba Ramwen. And if you look closely, I'm sorry to say, around his ankles, you can see the chains. He's being taken to Calabar, the British capital, and thus ends hundreds of years of unbroken rule by a family dynasty. He never sees his kingdom again. He dies in exile in 1914. But of course, after his death, the dynasty is restored. The British are very good at co-opting local elites, not just in Nigeria, and the dynasty carries on to this day, as you will all know. And not everyone is entirely accepting of this defeat. This is Ologboshere, who fights on, resists the British in an extraordinary guerrilla war for another 2 years, a man of incredible courage, treacherous and barbaric, the British called him. And this picture is taken moments before his execution in June of 1899. He's about to be shot by firing squad. I think today we would understand him better as a freedom fighter. But to the victims, the spoils. This man is called Lieutenant Norman Burrows, and he's posing back home in Derbyshire with some of his Benin loot. I'm just using him as an example. Like many of the officers, of course, he's not an art critic. He's not a an anthropologist. He's actually more interested in ivory tusks. He's posing proudly with them here. And this is taken from his own scrapbook. And look at his words at the bottom, Benin curios. These are curios, these are souvenirs, these are mementos of victory to the British officers. And in fact, Lieutenant Burrows actually takes part in this event, which is a reenactment of the capture of Benin at the Royal Military Tournament in London in 1898, here in Islington in North London, just a few streets away from where I'm speaking to you. And this event plays out to big crowds. Members of the royal family come, the King of Siam, who's visiting London, comes. It's a great success. And it has an air of authenticity because Burrows himself takes part, that man you just saw, and he brings one of the Maxim guns that captured Benin City. Now, like many of the officers, Burrows is also interested in making a quick buck from his loot. This is more of what he took. And during that Royal Military Tournament, he's selling several of these objects off to a great Victorian collector, Augustus Pitt Rivers. And you would have heard of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford still today. And Norman Burrows, if you're interested, he makes the equivalent of about, in today's money, £20,000, let's say $30,000 in selling off this loot. In other words, you know, don't get me wrong, a tidy sum of money, but not the sort of amount of money that is actually going to change his life forever. The real inflation in Benin bronze prices comes many decades later. Some of these objects, incidentally, the ones at the bottom, are then sold off by Pitt Rivers' family, who are in big financial difficulties in the 1950s and 60s. And they are in a museum in Boston now, the Boston Museum of Fine Art. So this is indicative of the process of dispersal of the Benin bronzes here in the Western world. And this man is crucial in that process, William Webster, the son of a Greenwich potato dealer. And what you have in London from 1897 to 1901 are a series of auctions of the Benin loot. And this man, William Webster, he cottons on very quickly that there is something unusual and valuable. And he's in touch with museum curators, especially in Germany. There's a great interest in Holland, in Austria, across Britain, in Scotland. And that is how the bronzes come to be spread around Western Europe. William Webster has a lot to do with it. Anyone who's done archival provenance research into Benin bronzes in European museums will find his name coming up again and again. But the biggest single collection goes to the British Museum. These are some 300 of the plaques, which the British Museum acquires in 1897. And this picture is taken in the British Museum today. For those who have been to the Sainsbury Gallery, this is how they're displayed in the British Museum today. They go on display there for the first time in September of 1897, so a matter of months after the expedition has returned. And the responses, when you go through the British newspapers of that time, are very interesting. You see words like remarkable, baffled, amazed. There is a contradiction between how Benin has been portrayed and what people are saying. Africa is allegedly a place with no history. And yet here we see Portuguese soldiers in 15th and 16th century armor depicted with great accuracy, which means that these plaques must presumably be at least 400 or 500 years old, and maybe the civilization must be much older than that. And so there is a contradiction between people's assumptions and the evidence of their own eyes. And so there is a great debate in British academia and indeed in Europe. Oh, it was the Portuguese themselves who made it. Oh, it was some wandering Egyptian tribe. Oh, some wandering Indian tribe. All these bizarre theories start coming out before people eventually have to recognize the evidence which is staring them in the face, which is that they are seeing the product of an indigenous African civilization. Something else, I suggest, is changing at this time. The Benin bronzes, as you will know more than myself, are made in a spiritual, religious spirit, but under a cold European gaze. In a museum, they become objects of art. They are appreciated aesthetically in a different way. In fact, the Foreign Office ends up giving these plaques to the British Museum. They'd initially been loaned going back to the history of the bronzes themselves, had initially been loaned for that exhibition of September 1897. And the British Museum is acquiring new Benin bronzes right up until the 1980s. Today it has almost 1,000, still the largest collection of 1897 loot in the world. Typically, it displays about 100 of those 1,000 objects. Now, not all Benin bronzes are in museums. Of course, one of the things I try to do in my book is follow the story of particular interesting pieces that have ended up on the private market. And by the 1970s, there is serious money in Benin bronzes. They are being sold for six-figure sums, and I'm talking pounds or dollars. And so their meaning is changing again. They are becoming investment opportunities for the wealthy and the reclusive, which brings me on to this wonderful piece, the so-called Oli head. Again, it's believed to be 15th century, bought by an art dealer, Ernest Orley, at an auction in London in the 1950s. It then spent 63 years in a London bank vault. Ernest Orley was Jewish. His family had fled the Nazis. He didn't tell his family what was hidden in the vault, only that it should not be opened unless there was a second Holocaust. Well, when he died, by the time he died, thank God, a second Holocaust had not happened, but the family did open the bank vault. In fact, they had to, because the bank was closing on Park Lane, and anyone with access to a safe box had to come and take out this object. His family took out this object in 2016, and as I reveal in my book, they sold it for a secret price of £10 million. And my conversation with the woman who sold it and the ethics of what she did was a riveting moment in my research, an extraordinary moment. Meanwhile, you may well be thinking, what about the Edo themselves, the people whose culture was stolen? Well, of course, you don't need me to tell you that the Oba and his people never abandoned the idea that their treasures would be returned to them. But for a long time, nobody was listening. You might recognize Usman Lawal Sula. I think he's called the Arala of Benin, and he's visiting the British Museum in 1965. Look at him cradling Queen Idia's head. You can almost hear him saying, please, when are we going to have it back? And he's talking to William Fagg, the short man there with the glasses, one of the famous curators of the British Museum. And this argument ebbs and flows over the decades. Of course, it comes up again at the time of the Festac Mask in the 1970s. And there was a British politician in the late 90s, a man called Bernie Grant, who forges links with the Oba's palace at the time and also takes up the cause. But I would say that really these are almost voices in the wilderness. They're very much on the periphery of the British political process, the British political scene. In the center, no one really is paying much attention. Now, there is a complicating factor to this, of course. Some of you might recognize the man on the right. His name is Kenneth Murray. Kenneth Murray came to Nigeria in the 1920s as an art teacher. He fell in love with the country, and he died in Nigeria, tragically, in a car crash en route to Benin City in the early 1970s. In fact, he died the weekend after Nigeria switched from driving from the left to the right-hand side of the road. And so his driver, some of you might be old enough to remember, his driver overtook blind on the Benin Expressway. He died in a head-on collision. In the 1940s and 50s, Kenneth Murray builds up Nigeria's museum system. And he is determined to bring back Benin bronzes as much as he can. And with the help of William Fagg, in auctions in London, he buys dozens of the very finest Benin bronzes, and he does take them back to Nigeria. And so it is important to say it, and people don't say it enough, Nigeria's National Museum System, the NCMM, have a superb collection of Benin bronzes, a small one, but a superb collection of dozens of Benin bronzes. Today, not many people attend the National Museum in Lagos, certainly not the huge crowds who used to go there in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in the 1980s and 90s, in particular, Nigeria's national museums suffer a series of notorious thefts, And some of the bronzes which were taken end up either back in Europe or the United States on the private art market. In some notorious cases, they even go back to prominent Western museums. And this is an important part of the story that not many people like to talk about. And yet, despite these problems, the restitution debate has changed quite dramatically in recent years. Now, I think this man has something to do with it. Many of you will recognize Mark Walker, a retired doctor from Wales. Well, when I pointed out his grandfather—
How are you, brother?
Walker,
All is good.
when I pointed out— hello there. I pointed out his grandfather, Captain Herbert Walker, at the beginning on the trip. Well, Captain Herbert Walker took an enormous amount of loot from Benin City. Mark Walker ended up inheriting just these two little pieces. And he had coveted them all his life. He'd always been fascinated in the story. But when he actually inherited them, something rather strange happened. He decided he was, in fact, not comfortable with them. And his children and his grandchildren told him that they were not comfortable either. And so in 2014, what did he do? In an act of, I would say, of moral courage, he gets on a plane to Nigeria, a country he's never been to before, and he travels to the Oba's palace. And of course, he's given a effusive reception, and he hands over these two objects. It's a striking individual act of conscience, but it seems to chime with other things which are going on in the West at that time. Some of you might have noticed Emmanuel Macron's speech, as was then, the new president of France in Ouagadougou. In 2017, he makes a speech saying it's no longer acceptable that so much of Africa's cultural heritage is in European museums. He commissions a report, which comes out the following year, I think, called the Savoir report, which is much more radical than many people had expected, and which sends, if you like, shockwaves through the European museum scene, and especially the museums of the major colonial powers, in particular Britain, France, and Germany. And so we come back to the present today. We have a situation in which, as I was saying right at the beginning of my talk, the bronzes are emblematic about the debate about colonial looted art. Today you have Cambridge Museum, Horniman, German museums, Smithsonian museums, all saying they want to give back their Benin bronzes. And in fact, some are already doing so. Here we are in Aberdeen University. I was lucky to be invited to this ceremony in October of late last year, along with representatives from the Oba's Palace. You can see the Oba's brother on the far side there. And the day before this ceremony in Aberdeen, Jesus College, Cambridge had handed back a bronze cockerel. So in other words, Britain had resisted returning any Benin bronzes for 125 years, and suddenly it gave back two in as many days. And here's the head. And perhaps some of you would have been at the ceremony when it eventually got back to the Oba's Palace. I think it was in February or no, April of this year, the ceremony for it and the cockerel. Now, one institution which I would say during this whole process of change is in a very tricky position and is looking increasingly isolated is the British Museum, the museum with the most Benin bronzes, arguably the finest Benin bronzes, and the museum with the greatest symbolic importance in this argument, the National Museum of the country responsible for the loot of the Benin bronzes. Well, this is a contentious area. The British Museum is prevented by law, the British Museum Act of 1963, from making permanent returns from its collection. It has a lot of freedom over loans, but it is now badly in danger of appearing out of tune with the times when it only talks about loans. Of course, in the past, the museum has often been accused of hiding behind the law as an excuse for inactivity, not just to do with the Benin bronzes, of course, Parthenon marbles and any other number of contested treasures. I think that's true. I think the museum has hidden behind the law, but I also think the law is a reality, and changing it would require a majority in the British Parliament. And that would require the support of this Conservative government, which we have here in the UK, which does not seem inclined to give it. In fact, I would say that the British government is perhaps ideologically the least comfortable with the process of restitution of all the major former colonial powers in Europe. We can talk, if you like, as well about, the very contested issue of who are we giving back to whom and to what? Of course, we might say that there are probably 3 institutions in Nigeria who have, I guess, expressed some sort of vested interest in this process. You have the federal government represented through the NCMM. You have the Oba's palace and the Oba himself, the direct descendant and probably, or indisputably, perhaps the man with the greatest moral authority in this case. And then you have the governor of Edo State, Godwin Obaseki. And the politics in Edo State have been complicated, as some of you know. I'm going to tread rather carefully here, and I'm just going to say that this is an extraordinary opportunity for the Edo. They have power and agency in this process, really, for the first time in 1897, and their position, if they spoke with one voice, would be even stronger. So let's see what happens. But of course, another thing that I think I've been guilty of today, and many people are guilty of, is talking about the story of the Benin bronzes as if it ended in 1897. And you and I know better than that. Here's Phil Omodamwen, one of the finest bronze casters of Benin City today. And here are people in his foundry. And the bronzes are still being made using the cire perdu, the lost wax method, a method of extraordinary sophistication. And so perhaps we should look at the story of the Benin bronzes in conclusion as one not of cultural loss, but of cultural endurance, because the culture has survived. And any visitor who has the good luck to go to Benin City today will feel the strength of Edo culture today. But you don't need me to tell you that. You will know that much better than I. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous pleasure for me to speak to you. That concludes my presentation. I hope it's given you food for thought, and I'd be very happy to let others take the stage and move on, or to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for that elaborate presentation of Benin artifacts. I know that you have done a lot of research to put this together, and I'm going to call our panelists to ask their questions right now.
Would you like me to stop sharing the screen so that we're all?
Yes, stop sharing the screen so that we can talk to people.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will call on Mr. Michael Ode. Mr. Michael Ode, do you have any questions, sir?
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. I'm happy to have you again. Since our interview, we've not been able to have a conversation. It was a beautiful presentation. I was able to put some points down. I will just go through this point later before I ask my question. So audience, please, my co-panelists, please have patience with me. The first one was that, I don't know the map that was presented the first time, the map of Benin. I believe that map was a model striking map of Edo Kingdom, because Benin Kingdom was expanded down, we created Lagos, so down to the south, down to Ghana and all those stuff. So putting it in that small context of it's today Benin, which Benin is under pressure now because we're losing our language, we're losing our culture, everything being polluted. I just wanted to get that clear. And the second one is the issue of human sacrifice. I think that kind of allegation was exaggerated by the British colonial masters, probably to justify the invasion of the Benin Kingdom. So it wasn't really a practice of the Benin people to be practicing human sacrifice. To me, I've studied Benin history, I've done research. It happens even in all African, many cultures, it does happen, but it wasn't official practice, official from the Benin Kingdom. So I just want to make that clear. I think that was a kind of a way of justifying the atrocity that they committed against Benin people, because there was a time that they said there were numerous scores everywhere in Benin. To our own research, the numerous scores came from when the British invaded Benin, they threw grenades, hand grenades into our market, and a lot of people were killed indiscriminately. And they have to gather them as a kind of evidence, but nobody could tell our story. That is one point. Another point is the invasion was, to our own, what we researched so far, was a pre-plan by the British invaders. They visited Benin, they saw these artifacts, and they were fascinated with it, and then they decided to create up a story. The whole thing is, if General Phillips so the adventure was successful, the British government would have still looked for another way to invade Benin. They were already interested in the artwork. In your presentation, correct, the Edo people, the Benin people, this artifact, they really don't know it as artwork like that. It was a spiritual thing. It was a way of communicating with our ancestors. So people were having them. If you lost your parents, you can go to the maker, the smith, they create one for you, you go and put it in your home, then you communicate, you worship, then you communicate with your ancestors. That is how it was done. So when the invaders came, they saw it as differently than what we saw. That is an artwork, and they could make money out of it. Then they went home and planned, create stories. They were telling our story. We were not telling our story. They were the one who told our story, who wrote our stories. We couldn't really. Our story were put on the artifacts. Our history were put there. Then another one again was that the stealing of the artifacts was they stole our history. Our history were taken away from us. All of us now who are researching this thing, we're just researching it based on probably an assumption. We don't really have a concrete evidence to prove this our history, because our history were physically our event, the wars, the victory, everything, the obas, the warriors, everything, they were all placed on Benin artifacts. So whatever that happened, people will be calling, they create the event through these artifacts. Say, this was recording something. Today we lost them all. So we are just people now trying to put things together. Our history is just away from us. The invasion was a stealing of history and destruction of our culture. So that's one. Then they created a story because we couldn't tell our own story. It is now we're trying now to create our own story. All the whole story about the invasion, what happened, how Philip was killed, they were all British story, not our stories. They create our story in order to sue them. Then we come to the Benin artifacts, which is my number 7 here. The Benin artifacts is now in private hands, as you just presented your presentation, which is correct. Because individuals have them, institutions, they are all having them. We're just talking about the museums, yes, but in private hands. So this is the goal of BACO, our organization, to make sure that these things are returned and to put pressure on the British government, because British government are just pretending that these things are with British Museum, so they is not in their hand. No, they control the British Museum. Using that argument is putting us in the dark. So we wanted to come out openly because they ordered the invasion. Who ordered the invasion? How the invasion was perpetrated, and then how these artifacts were taken away and put in the hands of this museum. They still control this museum, telling us that the museum should be handling all these things by themselves, when the museum themselves doesn't have the legal power to handle all these things to us. It makes things complicated. Then another one again is the Nigerian museums. I just want to say this here. The panel probably will agree, they will disagree. The Nigerian museum has never been interested in pursuing the return of the Benin artifacts. It's a very simple case. The reason is the tracks, this Benin is now more or less irrelevant in Nigerian political scene. So the people representing the Benins are no longer in the boardroom. So they are not interested. If it was the bigger tribes, It would have been interesting. They are interested now because we in Europe, probably back home, for example, we have started escalating this. We have contacted the governments of different countries. We have contacted the Nigerian government. The pressure is on them through our embassies and everything. They are now saying, okay, we have a place for them. This thing has been taken for 100 and something years ago, and Nigeria is over 70 years old. What have they done? Nothing. Because Benin is a small tribe that doesn't have a voice. That is one. Another one, like Macron, you just mentioned in your presentation, saying that we have their cultures, whatever, and it's a political statement. What has it done in physical terms? Returning on these things, what has it done? Nothing. It's a statement without action. So we're sick and tired of those things. It doesn't make sense to us anymore. That is why we are agitating. Bring this into us. It's our history. It's our part of our culture. No, it's our culture. Not part of our culture. It's our culture. Bring this our pride. We just want them. Then the British resistance, as I said before, is because the British government, the Benin, though themselves, they've not done enough. That is why the British museum resistance is successful. If we are putting pressure on them, bring this in as we are doing. If we were doing it before, they will listen to us. They are listening to us now. They got our letters. People have asked me many times that who are we? We just Edo people. We live in pain. We want this thing back to our kingdom. Then the preservation of the Benin, of the making of Benin bronze, yes. And let me just say, we have a plan on that. We're trying to have the Edo government and our royal palace to hear our own plan. I'm not going to reveal that plans here. I don't think my organization really approved it. We have a plan on how to preserve these making, not the artifacts themselves, so that these things will not stop, so that the production will continue, so that we will continue to transfer it from generation to generation. Because the idea now within our young generation is probably they are casting it as a thing of deities. That is, they are no longer interested, it's a modern thing, it's a spiritual thing, we're not Christians. No. We just want to make sure we sell it to them, change our mindset, that this thing, I have it behind me now, I have them here, they are all over my place here, that no, this is our beauty. It has nothing to do with idol worshiping or whatever, it's just our pride. So we should be proud of it. I have to thank you. My question in all is, in your own view, what do you think we Edo people should do to compare the British government, as German government has done, because we have contact with the German government, you are aware of it. So the British government, we have written them, they've not replied. Okay, the excuse they gave was that because of COVID-19, there were no people to really handle our case. So, but what can we do to compare the British government, not the museum, to bring this in home? Because if the British government, they are saying there is no law, they have to change law. Come on, that is just a children talk. You saw this thing, we're not even talking, we're coming to that. We will have somebody accountable for the destruction of Benin Kingdom, the killing of Benin people, because to our record, it was a genocide that was perpetrated against the Benin people. So nobody is talking about that, the destruction of a whole kingdom. A whole city was burned down, and a lot of people were killed, men and women raped. So we're not talking about, we're just telling the British government to bring this thing home. What do you think what should we do to get those things home before we move to the next stage? Because this is going to be a lifetime fight. I may not be there to end it, but I'm putting it, transferring it to my children as well. So that is it. That is my question. What can we do?
Should I answer?
Go ahead, sir, and answer the question.
Thank you. I mean, well, there was a lot of stuff before that, Mike. I agree with many. The map showed a small extent, but it was. You're right. If it had been drawn in the 17th century, it would have gone as far as Lagos. Okay. Was the issue of human sacrifice weaponized, exaggerated, used, propagandized by the British? Undoubtedly. Benin bronze is in private hands. It's much harder to prove. Through my own research, I've discovered, I think I'd say off the top of my head, I know of 20 Benin bronzes in private hands, including some very celebrated pieces. But I don't always know whose private hands. I just know that they're in private hands. It's much easier to deal with with institutions. Has the Nigerian government always been interested in restitution since independence? Was this at the top of General Babangida or General Abacha's in tray? Of course it wasn't. But some Nigerian politicians have cared about it at some times, I guess is one diplomatic answer. But let's bring it to the right to now and what you can do. Well, look, this is what I say, Mike. What is going on right now would have been inconceivable even 5 years ago. I think you're doing yourself down a little bit. Let me give you an example. I lived in Athens in Greece for 5 years. I was an Al Jazeera correspondent. And they built this amazing new Parthenon marble museum, waiting for the British to give back the Parthenon marbles. I mean, the Nigerians are promising to build a new museum. It doesn't exist yet. And if you told me 5 years ago that Britain would be returning Benin bronzes before returning Parthenon marbles, I would have told you you're mad. And yet here we are. It's incredible. And as perhaps, Mike, you know, I believe this is sort of breaking news. On July the 1st, there will be a ceremony now between the Nigerian government and the German government for the legal transfer of over 1,000 Benin bronzes in Germany. So we are going through a process of astonishing change. I think, you know, that's from your point of view, I would say that is, you know, surely that is very encouraging. Perhaps I think what worries me a little bit, and you might disagree, is that I feel a lot of these changes are actually taking part in the West and are driven ironically by a debate in the West, a sort of, you know, Black Lives Matter exploded out of the United States. And in the United States, it was very focused on slavery and police racism for obvious reasons. In Europe, it took the focus of the legacy of empires. And so suddenly objects like the Benin bronzes were in the spotlight. And so that process, for it to be ultimately successful, needs to be driven and led by, you know, Nigerians, Africans more broadly, or in this specific case, by the Edo. You know, the British political scene does not seem encouraging for changes to the law. I've got to say that. But I would say Britain is, you know, that affects the national collections. It doesn't affect Cambridge University, which has something like 300 Benin bronzes, by the way. It doesn't affect Oxford University, doesn't affect many other smaller, the Horniman Museum in London wants to give back its Benin bronzes. So things are changing outside of the national scene. I would also say as well, you know, in history, things look inevitable and glacial, and then suddenly they melt. Even our own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, you know, I mean, I think he's somebody, how can I put it? You know, he's not necessarily a conviction politician. He's a populist. And if he sees a boost in global Britain through giving back the Benin bronzes, well, then things might change very quickly. What seemed impossible a few years ago, it suddenly now seems inevitable. I know that doesn't answer everything, but that's the way I would say, look at the situation.
So thank you, sir. I will call Dr. Patricia Fadaka Igbinovia to ask a question. Hello, ma, can you hear us clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, ma. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you, madam. Thank you.
I always want to add Barnaby Phillips, so we don't mistake it for the other Philip. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your keen interest in Benin artifacts. All this restitution you are talking about has been brought to light because of your interest, personal interest, and visit to the source of the problem. Visited Benin, you go around researching Europe, everywhere to find out where the hideouts are for the artifacts. So you brought out some meaningfulness about our artifacts. Benin Kingdom was badly treated. And let me, on a quick note, add, I read your book from page 1 to 192, 93, and I find it very interesting. I would like to read it over and over again, because you are a modern author who is seeing things in our own perspective, the perspective of the Benin Kingdom, who were badly treated, who were badly wounded, who were humiliated, and the kingdom destroyed and burned down. But we had no voice. Many of the earlier authors, British like Rawson, rushed home to write nasty documentation about what he did not even experience, because he ran home after he didn't take part in the expedition, but he wrote about the Benin Kingdom, nasty things. And our students who are under the tutelage of Britain and European countries write their dissertation based on lies, based on the exaggerations by earlier authors. But you are humane. You've taken a stance that is not skewed. It's not negatively skewed. You see things the other way. Like they were saying, the Oba of Benin shut down trade. Then you said, what if the Oba of Benin was protecting his personal interest and the interest of his own kingdom, that they should not be exploited? And then in the interview done by Oba Barnaby before his demise in 1914, he said that he felt cheated by the Chekiris who were acting as middlemen and were making more profits on the sweat of the products produced in his own kingdom. That's why he shut down trade. The middlemen were more accessible to the Europeans. They collect goods and go and sell at a higher rate. That was not fair. Benin Kingdom, was suppressed. It was a civilized kingdom before the British came in. The Portuguese came in. They were not antagonistic. They were friendly. They did not take what did not belong to them. The artifacts that were stolen, whatever they are worth, should be returned. When a thing is stolen, it should be returned to the owner with apology. With apology. I read your book from beginning to end, and you are for restitution, that the item should be returned. So I was surprised at the end of the book, it became an anticlimax, that even the son of Oba, one of the participators in the group, with the curator, the prince, and the notaire, now suggesting that, well, the past is past 125 years ago. Let bygone be bygone. Now we can say we will borrow the items from British Museum. It's not done. You don't borrow what you own. So on principles, the items should be returned. If you make the mistake of saying sign, we are borrowing from Britain our stolen items, then you have given them ownership. And that is a defeatist attitude of all you have done to bring this idea up that these items should be returned. Now, anti-climax, let's borrow, let's just sign so that they can bring some back. We open a new museum and put them. That's a short-term gain. We have waited 125 years for somebody to speak for us, and you are the voice. So we don't want to, you said this is an extraordinary opportunity when you were summarizing it, that these items should be returned. So let no anti-climax come, let nobody sign on behalf of Benin Kingdom that the items are going to be borrowed. It's taking us back. It would be like the 1892 treaty that was not even signed by the Oba, and they put crosses for his signature to say he signed, and it was being pursued all over the place. So no borrowing, no treaty, no document should be signed to say we are borrowing. On the reading your book, I like your title. You said Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes. Powerful. Loot. Who looted? Britain looted. Whose bronzes? Benin Kingdom. So if you were to put in perspective the title Benin Massacre and British Expedition, I think you would have said Massacre, Britain, and Benin self-defense. So I leave that for you to take up and retitle that aspect of our history. Who were massacred.
Yeah.
The Benin people were massacred in thousands. And the British went out to say that the corpses that were found in various modes, they even counted the number from a height, that they were of Benin's sacrifice. No, it was to tarnish the image of the Benin Kingdom. Benin Kingdom was a civilized place, and they did not allow stench. If there was stench, why was it that the British were able to stay many days behind to loot and use African carriers to carry the stolen items? And then here the place was smelling, not of corpses from sacrifice, but of massacred people when the Mazin gun was used on them. It wasn't a fair fight. And Benin resisted with their little resources. It was the First World War because Britain assembled people from India, all the various posts where they had traders and soldiers, black men and colored people to fight for them. It was not a fair fight. So I thank you for taking this up, but I don't want a situation where we say we borrow. We will not borrow on a short term just to open a new museum. The fight has lasted for 125 years. I will now have a voice through you and some other dedicated people who are objective in their reasoning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ma. Go ahead, sir, and answer the question. You actually summarized one of my questions about how the British writers perceived the Benin Kingdom compared with the 19th century. There's a kind of a paradigm shift on how British writers perceive the Edo people. So thank you, Ma, for that question. Go ahead, sir, and answer her question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you. And thank you so much for taking the trouble to read my book. I'm delighted that you did. I mean, see, if I could just talk about the present, you know, I'm basically a journalist, so I try and lay out the different arguments. I talk to different people, but my style very much, and maybe it's, you know, from my old World Service days, is to allow the reader to draw their own conclusion. I'm delighted if people should read my book and conclude that the Benin bronzes should go back to Benin and there should be a restitution for historical injustice. But I'm not going to sort of, you know, bang you over the head or bang the reader over the head and say, this is the path that should be taken. This is the way in which they should go back. And in fact, if you listen to the current Oba or if you listen to his father, indeed, if you talk to the people who are running NCMM at the moment, you know, successive Benin royal families have been very clear that the Benin bronzes have been wonderful ambassadors of Benin culture. And so I think most people envisage a situation, or what I believe many people want is a recognition of historical wrong. They want the ownership matter to be resolved in favor of the Edo and the Nigerians. They want many important objects to go back to Benin City. But I don't think I don't think either the Edo royal family or the Nigerian government envisage a world in which every single Benin bronze stays in Benin City and stays in Nigeria forever. That these, you know, I think I would like to live in a world in which we learn from each other and wonderful like this circulate around. So I hope I'm answering that. If I can talk about Pen, what you were saying about British attitudes in the 19th century. Oh yeah, and so sorry. One thing I would say, you know, And one thing you've both made very clear, Mike, as well, is, you know, the lack of the voice and the British writing your story for you. And I could not agree more with that. And you know, we need to have more Edo historians telling the story. And then for those who are not there at the beginning, I emphasize that I felt qualified to talk about the intersection between Britain and the Edo. I could never tell a story from the Edo perspective, but I tried as hard as possible to absorb it. And so it was wonderful, you know, to come across, you know, booklets like this. Many of you would have known the great Ekaguse Essien, who passed away sadly, aged 90, and this is his grandfather's memoirs. And for me, as an Anglophone scholar, this book is gold dust, because in 28 pages we have an Edo defender of Benin City telling us what he thought. Now, of course, Captain Galway and Reginald Bacon and Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so's diaries and whatever are interesting to me, but to be brutally honest, they're all a bit similar. And for me, you know, I wish there were 5 more of these memoirs of the Edo defenders. And then, you know, that would have, you know, be so enriching and enable us to tell the story in a more complete way. But in overall terms, you're absolutely right that in the 19th century, I think the nature of British imperialism changed. You don't only see it in relation to the Edo, you see it, for example, in a much bigger example like India, you know, that it had been, you know, relatively racially relaxed, and then it becomes much more partly, you know, driven by Christian missionaries and trade and all sorts of other reasons. A sense of racial superiority is part of the sort of growing trend of Victorian Britain, and that reflects in the way in which it treats people, and the way in which the empire expands, and the way in which it treats other people. And the Edo in 1897, I would suggest, are tragic victims of that, to return back to, you know, what Mike was talking about, and the actual circumstances of the invasion itself.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's quite interesting to us as the Beninese that a British writer of today is writing about, you know, the return of Benin artifacts. So it's amazing. That is why many of us are impressed with your book, and the book written by Dan Hicks, Professor Dan Hicks as well. So we appreciate that. Without wasting time, let me quickly call another person. Barrister NY Fred Ogeriahe, are you ready, sir? Unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I want to thank Mr. Phillips for the great work you've done in your book. I'm going to be speaking on the legal implication as it relates to specifically the repatriation or the restitution of these artifacts to Nigeria. I've had the opportunity to listen to quite a few number of debates as to who has the local standard or the right of ownership to these artifacts. I want to start by saying, I'm not going to deal with the historical aspect of this discussion. I'm going to deal with the legal aspect of this discussion, that these artifacts and the bronzes, they tell a story of the tradition, the culture, the mode of spirituality of a particular people in Nigeria, and that is the Benin people. It wasn't a widespread that the United Kingdom of Benin was a sovereign nation when this incident occurred. And we had a sovereign monarch when this incident occurred. And that these artifacts were taken from a particular place when it occurred. So that the principle of restitution ad integrum or restitution in integrum provides that the owner must be brought to his original position as if this incident didn't occur in the first place. Now, the question then lies as to how do we restitute the original owner? Now, it is very clear, and we all now appreciate that these are Benin bronzes, and they were looted, or if I may use a more aggressive word, stolen from the palace of the Oba of Benin. And that the Oba of Benin do have a local standard as the sovereign or the majestic leader from the remotest antiquity to today, to have a say, a conclusive say, as to where these bronzes are repatriated to. I am not exempting the federal government, because I've had discussion about, you know, the generality of the relevance of these artifacts to Nigeria. I would say that has arisen as a result of the international debate surrounding these artifacts, and that the fact that they're from Nigeria. I do accept that, but that it is known and recognized internationally that these artifacts were made by specialist craftsmen from the United Kingdom of Benin, and that they tell the traditional, the spiritual mode, the religious belief, the culture of the Benin people, not all the ethnic groups in Nigeria. So that the Oba of Benin has the local standard, the interest as regards the ownership of these artifacts. Now, like I stated earlier, I do not want to exclude the federal government. And I think federal institutions, state institutions should act as facilitators of these artifacts to the palace of the Oba of Benin. Some might say, well, I'm just being overwhelmingly too traditional and too personal about this. But that's the history of the Benin artifacts. That's the true history of the Benin artifacts. The legal law in respect of restitution applies as a general concept or a general narrative that the true owner of the artifacts must be identified and brought back to the original position. Now, as an earlier commentator mentioned, this idea of sharing, possession of the artifacts or borrowing, that shouldn't arise. The procedure of restitution or the procedure of reparation should be complete, because I think the Benin people have suffered enough. The fact that these historical artifacts, I mean, you mentioned the amount of money some of them are being sought for. The amount of money they've been sought for, the relevance of these artifacts to the Benin Kingdom is quite enormous, particularly to the palace of the Oba of Benin. The citizens of Edo State who suffered, of the Benin Kingdom who suffered as a result of this. That is another aspect. Now, I have stated that the artifacts should be returned to the palace of the Oba of Benin. I'm also saying, as an alternative argument, that the facilitators should include the federal government, not for the purpose of saying, well, we have a right to keep this, to facilitate the artifact to the original owner and to the original people. We are willing to, whatever we want to do about, sharing the viewing of the artifacts in the United Kingdom of Benin, we would go about doing that. So the question that I want to put to you is, what is the position of the British government or these other private individuals, if you are aware, as to where do they intend to return these artifacts to? We had questions about, where do you, Edo people, want us to return these artifacts to? Now, from the argument that I've advanced, which are strictly legal argument, where do you intend, considering that you have that knowledge as to where you got them from, where do you intend to return them to?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, I mean, I guess one thing you've got to make clear, and perhaps this is especially the case in Britain, but it applies to all the countries where there are Benin bronzes, but perhaps especially in Britain, that different institutions which hold different Benin bronzes, even within the museum sector itself, have very different constitutions, very different outlooks. So the way in which the British Museum is governed is very different to the way the University of Aberdeen Museum is governed, and it was able to act with much more autonomy. I mean, I can tell you from my conversations with some of the key individuals involved. I mean, Mark Walker, when he returned his Benin bronzes, I know it's one micro example, but I think symbolically it's an example. He was determined that they should go to the Oba's palace, which from where his grandfather stole them. And he did not want to give them to the federal government. He wanted to return them directly to the Oba's palace. That's one man. I know, I suppose if I was generalizing, I would say the museum, and I think the museum curators in Britain who are most in favor of restitution would be very concerned if the Oba and the palace were not going to be involved in some way in the process, if that answers your question. And they will, while they hold on to these objects, they will try, that gives them a degree of power and a bargaining position, and they will want to make sure that is the way in which they will be that is what will happen to them before they give them back. But I've got to tell you as well that I've met private owners of Benin bronzes who will say, and dealers in Benin bronzes in Britain, and they will say, you know, legally, we feel safe. Legally, our ownership is not in doubt, and that the arguments for restitution are ethical, they are moral, they are compelling in that regard, and those forces can be very powerful politically, as we're seeing, but they are not necessarily legal. Perhaps somebody like you can, you know, bring forward a challenge and make a test case, and then we have a precedent. And of course, laws do change over time, and we've seen, for example, with Nazi stolen loot. Well, you know, the British government stands on a pedal, says, oh, it can never change the British Museum Act. But lo and behold, they did in relation to Nazi stolen loot. And so laws do change. They lag behind ethical and moral changes, but they often do catch up. And in fact, if you talk to British Museum trustees, as I do in the book, and you say, well, look, what is the difference between Nazi loot and the loot of the Benin bronzes, they'll say things like, well, you know, you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere, you know, is that line 1900? Well, you know, and they sound rather awkward as they come up with these reasons. And you say, well, 1897 is rather close to 1900. Or is that line, you know, geographical? Is it a line that goes somewhere through the Mediterranean? Well, then people have to start justifying things in very uncomfortable ways to do with race and colonialism, which people aren't prepared to do, thankfully. So you feel ultimately the real weapon that the Edo people have is a moral and an ethical weapon at this moment. Perhaps the law will catch up and support them in the future, but I fear it's not there yet, if that helps answer the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I will call on Professor Omozuwa. Are you there, sir? Professor Omozuwa. Okay. So if not, Professor Esoya Moregbe, can you take the floor, ma? Are you there?
Okay. Okay, yes, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, ma.
Okay. I really want to thank you, Mr. Barnaby Phillips, for the very detailed presentation. I've not read your book, but from your presentation, there's no doubt that you did a very detailed research to have come up with your findings. I commend your efforts a great deal. Congratulations. I look forward to reading your book over and over again. So from your presentation, there is no doubt that a great injustice was done to the Benin populace by the Western world. And it showed all over the stages of your presentation. We don't want to go through the different stages because some of those injustices have been highlighted by the previous speakers. There is no doubt that the British government has it in mind to return those artifacts. I believe personally that they have it in mind to return those artifacts. But I think we have to be patient with them. I believe personally that we have to be patient with them. that is not the area I want to speak on. I want to go to your conclusion. You said you are not concluding on the fact that what has been done to the Benin populace actually involve culture, endurance, or culture loss. Somehow, I just put down culture loss, but not culture loss, but culture endurance. I think that's the summary that you gave. What you implied there is that what was done to us did not involve culture loss, but culture endurance. Is that right? Is that what you wanted to tell us?
No, I think what I wanted to say in summary was that undoubtedly the Edo people suffered an extraordinary cultural loss in 1897, but despite that, many aspects of their culture endure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So what I really want to say is that injustice that was done to the Benin Kingdom actually affected many areas of the culture of the Benin people. And the question what I want to say is that all through the years we have endured. The question now is, what plans are being made by the British government in particular to compensate the Beninese for the various aspects of our culture that were affected by that injustice that they did to us? You know, it is one thing to be clamoring for the return of the artifacts, but we should also look at the damages that they did to the various aspects of our culture, the pains, the trauma that the Benin people went through all these years, the ruins. We want to believe that a lot of people died as a result of this. Many lives were cut short because of that injustice. Apart from that, the creativity of our people, was not being recognized anymore. So what are we going to say concerning the area of compensation? How are the people who are living now, the Benin people who are living now, going to, what will I say now? How are they going to enjoy from the return of the artifacts, apart from the physical return of the artifacts? What plans are the British government making to make sure that they make the Benin people to forget the ruins of yesteryears, the trauma that they put the Benin people through all these years?
Yeah.
Did you get the question?
Thank you, Ma.
The language and other aspects of our culture were really tampered with. And all through the years, we have been trying to make repairs, and it's not been easy. many of these aspects were as damaged aspects were as a result of the stolen artifacts. They should not just be thinking of returning the artifacts only. They should also be making plans to compensate the Benin populace. That is the area I'm emphasizing. And so that is the area I want you to address in this presentation. I don't know if you have anything to say concerning this.
Thank you, ma. Thank you. Thank you. Like what I highlighted in my book, that the intergenerational trauma is still prevailing in the lives of many Edo people, even those of us who did not witness the British expedition of 1897, we still suffer from the intergenerational trauma. So thank you, ma, for that question. Go ahead, Mr. Barnaby Phillips, and answer the question.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I'm not a spokesman for the British government, but and I have to answer truthfully. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't see that the British government has any plans to compensate the Edo people for what happened in 1897. Indeed, this particular British government has cut the proportion of overseas aid which it gives development assistance. It was previously committed to give 0.7% of GDP, which is ultimately where any money that would go to the Edo or any else would come out of that percentage, and it has cut that. If you're asking me personally, as a private British citizen, I would like to see Britain as a country which is generously engaged with the rest of the world, not least those parts of the world like the Edo Kingdom, with which it has been entangled historically. But that is my personal preference.
Okay, thank you. I will call Professor Dosa Omozuwa to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I would like to thank Mr. Barnaby Phillips for the beautiful presentation. My worry is actually knowing the extent and the number of these artifacts we are talking about now. I don't know whether in that book, because I have not read it, I don't know whether there is an aspect dedicated to, the statistics of these artifacts, either in the hands of private individuals or in the museums or institutions, not only in Britain, but all over the world, because the artifacts are spread all over the world. So I don't know whether there is going to be possible to be able to, have a statistics of the actual number, which is, I think it may be difficult to do that, but, is there any effort towards, trying at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It's a very good question. I'll correct you slightly. You say spread all over the world. Actually, they're not really spread all over the world. They're spread all over the Western world. In fact, they're spread across Europe, the United States, a few perhaps in New Zealand and Australia, but they're not. They're spread across the Western world in the political sense. But you're absolutely right. Of course,
sir, I'm sorry that I'm interjecting. When you say spread around the world, what about some that we're taking back to Africa? Is there any Benin artifacts in Africa? I'm sure that some were returned back to Nigeria.
Yeah, I think off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any 1897 loot in sub-Saharan Africa, apart from that which has returned to Nigeria.
Nigeria, okay.
If there are, they would be tiny, possibly in South Africa, but I don't think we're talking about any substantial amount. Really, the huge collections are in Britain, in Germany, and then to a certain extent, France, Holland, Austria, Sweden, the United States, especially from about 1945 onwards, starts to acquire Benin bronzes in great numbers. and some, as I say, have ended up in Australia and New Zealand. But nonetheless, I think that the point remains exactly who is actually going to catalogue this. And here we do have good news. Some of you would have heard of the Digital Benin project, in which brings together Western museums. It's something that's very good, that's come out of the Benin Dialogue Group, but it also brings together leading Edo scholars. So Godfrey Ekator, who's there in Benin City with you, who some of you will know, he's actively involved. And I know that Barbara Plankensteiner and her team, they were in Benin City, what was it, just a month ago or so. And so what this is very interesting, and it is a breakthrough that we can now have in our digital world that was not possible before, which is getting museums, especially here in the West, to be much more open and accountable about what they hold in those notorious inventories and cellars that we never actually see. I spoke about the stores, as they're called. I spoke, for example, about the British Museum having, I think they've got 950 something Benin bronzes, only 100 are on display. That as a ratio is not untypical at all. And I think we do see encouraging signs that museums in the West are being much more open and accountable about what they have. And the Digital Benin website is meant to go, I mean, the website exists already, but the actual inventory, I think they're saying later this year, it will be available. And then, that ought to be a definitive archive, incidentally, including the NCMM, including what's in the Lagos store, and a definitive archive of what Benin bronzes there were and what their provenance was, and what was stolen in 1897. Of course, it's going to be a gradual process. It's going to go on for some time. Of course, the private market and private owners are the great sort of unknown factor in this, but we are in a much better place than we were 2 or 3 years ago to get a good idea of what was taken and where it is today. Even the amount of digital research that I was able to do in the process of writing my book, would have been an awful lot harder 5 or 10 years ago. So we are moving in that direction.
Yeah, Godfrey was not able to join to this program. He told me that he wanted to join. I don't know why he's not here. So we are also working with Godfrey with regards to the Digital Benin project. That is a very interesting one. I joined the last seminar when they were in Benin. So very quickly, let me call Dr. Edith. Are you there? Dr. Gladys Ikiri, are you there? Dr. Gladys Abeze Ikiri, are you there, ma'am? Okay, unmute yourself. Go ahead. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. And there is a noise in the background. Okay. Take care of your mic. I'll get back to you. Let me quickly call Professor Alex Igbineweka. Are you there, sir?
Yes, I am here.
So introduce yourself briefly and ask your question, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am Professor Alex Gosa Igbineweka, the Gosa language evolutionist and creator. First of all, I thank God the Almighty for bringing us here this day, and thank every member of this great panel. Then I thank our guest, Mr. Barnaby Phillips, whom I would like to christen from today as Adaze in Edo language, because I'm a linguist talking from the linguistic aspect, like our brother, the legal profession, the legal guru, Giriahim, he spoke from the legal aspect of the whole issue. And as a linguist, I like to christen you Adaze, meaning a respectable personality in the community, for all your detailed research and tenacity in taking the roads, the paths less traveled by others. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. And please accept my title, Adaze Barnaby Phillips.
Got a new title here today.
Yeah.
Got a new title.
Having said that, I like to thank the very first speaker after on Adaze Phillips spoke. I forgot his name. Please, can you update me with the name of the gentleman who opened the?
Okay, Mr. Michael Ode.
Ode, thank you very much. Oh my God, he gave a very great expo on the whole lecture presented by Mr. Phillips. I followed him so much, and then some of the things he said, I wish I documented all of them, but he said, plan to preserve. He mentioned that there is plan going on to preserve the making. And if you guys remember, I have been hitting on this point, Sister Nekme. Remember, I told you I want to write a letter to the present Oba of Benin, that while we are fighting for the return of the Benin artifact, all energy should also not be diverted to one aspect, to one channel. We should also concentrate on the continuity, because looking at it, to me, this artifact we are now trying to reclaim were made by human beings. They didn't fall from the sky or from the ghost. These people, they are no more alive. We should create a day to honor them. We should create something to honor them in posthumously. And also, we should create opportunity for the continuity of this art. Otherwise, very soon, they will die off. So we should try to sustain, rebuild. If you see the scientists who manufacture vehicles, they didn't just stop in one, the car of 1913. They still continue to today. So what are we doing with those for the sustenance, for the continuity of these great worldwide celebrities? What are we doing to sustain this artifact? So that is my major point of the whole issue. And then those who are pursuing the restitution, the return of the artifact, fine, I appreciate them. They are doing a great job. They should continue that. While we also, another factor, continue on the preservation of this great scientific work bestowed on the great Benin people. And then another thing Mr. Ode asked, he said, what can we do to compare the British government to return our artifacts? Well, that's another good question. Why we are, the former Obas of Benin Kingdom, Oba Kenzua, Erediawa, and now Ogediga, they've been trying, and as well as great Benin people like you and I, for the return of this thing. However, if the British government is going to do anything in the return of this artifact, it has to do with the effort, the pressure, the continuity put up by the Benin Kingdom, because constantly and consistently are the wings of success. If you have them, you will fly to the stars. So that pressure should be continued. It should never be relented in any way. So if we continue, they will return all this. And in fact, whatever we want the British government to do with our artifact depend on how the level of the pressure and consistency mounted on the British. And we have to draw the plan, the blueprint and work on the blueprint. People like Barnaby Phillips can now take up the plan to wherever he can, seek audience. And so this is what the Benin Kingdom want. So that has to be there. We have to be constant and consistent with our drive for the return of the Benin artifact. And then again, we go to while we are doing that too, until they return this artifact, my suggestion, this is my point, we can create maybe a method whereby the British Museum can give the Benin, the Oba Palace, some royalty for the custody, for whatever sales they made out of the Benin artifacts in their custody in Britain. Yeah, we can pressurize them. If people go there, either to view our artifact or to buy or whatever, there must be a law that a certain percentage of that item should be given to the Benin, to the Oba's palace. And then once we go after that, that's another way we can make income until the whole artifact are returned to us, because I cannot tell you they will be returned this year, next year, or whatever. Whereas the British government, they are making profit of our sweat. So until then, we should compel them to give the Oba's palace certain percentage of their sales proceed. And this is where our brother, Barrister Ogeriaki, the idea came in my mind. So that is good. And then for the sustenance or continuity of this product, I will also request that Barnaby Phillips should help us to, now we're in the modern technology. Those days, these things we are done in the crude, natural way. It's okay. But we now have modern, sophisticated equipment. So how can Barnaby Phillips help us get modern equipment to these artifact makers in Igueron, in the Benin city, so that to encourage the young ones to take up this art? There are so many scientific equipment right now all over the world. Before you go, you do things in the crude way, but now before you talk Jack Robinson, something is done. So Philip, I leave that to you. Please, whatever you can do to help provide the manufacturers the modern equipment for the continuity of this Benin artifact or Benin bronze, please, I would suggest you help us with that. So I rest my case at this level.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, interesting. Go ahead, sir, and answer the question. Barnaby Phillips.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the granting of the title. I'll wear that one with pride, and you'll all be invited to the forthcoming ceremony, undoubtedly.
That would be great.
Yeah. Of course, my own contribution, I'm a journalism, I'm a writer, I'm out there in the public forum. The best way in which I can contribute to this story is to spread the word, to raise consciousness, to carry on doing journalism, to carry on updating my book. And don't worry, I will absolutely continue to do that. But you do raise some important points, which I think many people in Benin City are thinking about very carefully going forwards. Of course, when the bronze casters resumed their work in the 1920s under Oba Eweka II, things had changed from pre-1897. Before 1897, the bronze casters could rely on the patronage of the Oba. He could supply them with housing, with clothes, with wives, and so on. And after, from the 1920s onwards, the way in which the bronze casters worked was more commercial. They were selling often, if you look back at their work before the Second World War, they're selling effectively high-class tourist art to often to colonial officials in the 1920s and 30s, and so on today, the bronze castles on Egon Street today. They need visitors, they need tourists. And how is that going to work? You know, there's a lot of factors at play. There's the issue of, you know, insecurity in Nigeria, whether tourists want to, you know, travel to Nigeria, and whether then they want to travel, how far they want to travel beyond Lagos, and all of those factors are, you know, out of the hands of the Edo or the Oba, unfortunately. And what will be the sustainability? Let's say there is some wonderful new Benin Royal Museum. Well, what's the sustainability? How is it going to fund itself going forward? You know, I mean, I know that, you know, lots of groups are talking about funding the building of a new museum, but that's one thing. Making it sustainable going forward for decades to come is a big challenge. And anyone who has studied Nigerian history since independence will know that challenge. Projects can start with much hope and optimism, but they need to be very carefully planned, and they need dedicated political support and continuity over decades to work. And so, you know, what I can say is that this story is still moving. It's still fluid. It's not over at all. And that's why it's a very exciting time to be reporting on it.
Thank you, sir. I will call it Dr. Ameze Ihimi again. Are you ready, ma?
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Sound like clear now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Adaze Phillips. Very interesting lecture. In fact, I'm not a historian, but I learned a lot from what you taught us today. It's actually very painful and disheartening to know all these things that happened long, long ago to the Benin people. And if we want to talk about that, even hearing what you said today is like reopening old wounds.
Yeah.
It's a pity we had to go through all this. But all the same, it has happened. And from your lecture, there's something really I got that I was not really clear. You said all that we have been doing, the Benin people have been doing, is more of ethical, moral, but not legal. In a situation like this, even because we're small people, even in Nigeria, it's small. The Benin people are just a minor group amidst bigger groups in Nigeria. How do you think we can do something legal to make sure that this comes out? I believe that why the British are doing what they are doing is because probably the word looted or stolen is used. Used to talk about artifacts. They looted artifacts far back 1897. I feel maybe they are spited by that. But if the word taking was used, I believe something would have been done. But however, whatever word was used for there, it was not enough. They are telling us restitution. They're telling us we're supposed to live morally and live upright, and yet they are doing what is not right. I'm very happy when I read from the internet about Emmanuel Macron when he returned when he encouraged France to return about 26 of the artifacts to the Benin Kingdom, and also for private schools like University of Aberdeen returning 2 of the artifacts. I believe God is doing something, and I believe that the other artifacts will be returned. And I strongly believe that once they notice that people are returning the artifacts, then it will come to Benin. Let us be a little patient. My worry is this. If we begin to talk at this point about compensation, don't you think we are deviating from the substance and pursuing shadows? If we also talk about collecting some money, let them be paying the Benin Kingdom some money when they go to the museum, collect some money, they pay to Benin Kingdom. I feel they will look at us as if we are no good people. We are fighting for what belongs to us. We shouldn't be bothered about whatever money comes out of it. Let them return it. We can also have a museum where people go to watch and we collect money ourselves. It doesn't matter how many years. It might not come out now, but I believe that one day it will come out. God will put somebody there that will say return, just as Macron has done. Return these things back to the people, because these things will become problems to you people. So my own worry is, how can we talk about the legal aspect. How can we make a cry to the world that these things are needed? We need them because you come to think of it, the way that these artifacts are done now are quite different from how they were before. You cannot talk about the symbols those ones represent compared to this. Just as Admiral Phillips has said now, that most of these artifacts that are done now are being sold. They are being sold. So now these ones don't carry the symbol, the spiritual symbols that those ones that we had before carry. So I believe that we should be patient to receive. Let our ancestors be happy that we are able to fight to the very end to get these artifacts back, no matter the cost. Let us not put before the British, because they are very, 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 very smart. Let us not put before them that we want compensation, because by the moment we say that, we are selling our birthright and they will look at us as cheap. They will be willing, I believe, to give us something. And when they do that, they will never return those artifacts. So I want to beg us not to think about that, but rather I want Philip to advise us on what we can do. He just said something that he doesn't know when they'll bring it, he doesn't know how, but he said that we are acting. Our standard is more of ethical, moral, but not legal. I want him to throw more light. How can we go legal so that we can be able to claim that which belongs to us? Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Well, I mean, yeah. I'll return to something I said to Mike O'Dea. You know, a lot of people today have been saying, you know, what can we do? Things are not going well. And I would say, actually, things are changing very, very fast. Look, this is the paperback edition of my book. I had to write a whole new chapter for the events of 2021, 2022. This story has not moved from 1897 till about 2017, and suddenly I can't keep pace with the extent of change. So, you know, I mean, I'm not going to ask people to be patient about, you know, historical wrong committed all these years ago, but I would say, objectively speaking, it seems to me that things are moving quite quickly. You know, I defer to my honourable legal friend on the legal issues. It would seem to me that it would have to be done on a state-to-state basis. Is this something that the federal government of Nigeria would like to take on or not? And if you talk to, you know, the Ministry of Information and Culture or the people in NCMM at the moment, I think they feel things are going pretty well at the moment with the Benin bronzes. There is a lot of momentum around. There's about to be a huge ceremony in Germany. If all they're relying on is ethical and moral arguments, well, they're not doing badly at all. Those arguments seem to carry a lot of weight and are forcing European museums and institutions into extraordinary reversals of long-held positions. Having said that, of course, and you know, maybe Fred or Garike would be able to explain this better. Maybe there is some legal test case that an individual could take up, bring before an international court, and create a precedent. And I think we would have seen more of such efforts if the political process had not been so successful for the restitution movement in the last 3 or 4 years. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I have one quick question there, sir. You know, do you think the Edo people are loud enough in their campaign for the restitution of Benin artifacts?
I'm sorry, do you think, say that again?
Do you think the Edo people are loud enough in their campaign? Yes.
Pressure.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, you know, of course, the Edo people have, you know, they were colonized.
What I'm trying to say here is that if we are loud enough in our campaign for the restitution of these Benin artifacts, you know, for me, I personally believe that we are not doing enough.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Well, I mean, I think there is a power dynamic at play here. Let's be very honest. Me, as a British author, somebody who can, you know, work through the British archives, meet people in the British Museum, I have more of a voice. It's easy for me than somebody sitting who's frustrated in Benin City. I think you will know better than me whether the Edo people make their voice heard enough at a federal level in Nigeria. From Oba Ekenzwa II in the 1930s, successive Obas have spoken about this issue with great passion over the decades. This is not something that the Edo people suddenly woke up to in 2017 or 2014 when Mark Walker turned up in the palace. I will never forget my first visit to Benin City in 1999. And I knew very little about 1897, and it seemed to be all people spoke about to me for 3 days when my first visit there 22 years ago. So I hear the Edo people loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So let me call Mr. Sunday Okoro to ask his question. Hello, sir, can you hear me? Mr. Sunday Okoro is joining us from the United States today. Go ahead. Go ahead, sir. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself first. We can hear you. So after Mr. Sunday, then Mr. Sampson, then we're going to end the program. We have been here for almost 2 hours now. Okay,
Thank you.
Go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Author Barnaby. I have read some of your book, and I appreciated, and the Benin people appreciated the light you threw into the history that has passed. Not until I read your book, most of the information that I knew was very, very far from me. You have dealt enough on most of the questions that they asked today. The only question that I really would like to ask is, you talked about the legality of what the British have to stand on and what the Benin people have to stand on. We have moral and ethical issue, and that is what we are pursuing. Now, one, who decides this moral and ethical issue? Two, if in comparison to the issue of the Holocaust, we all know, and I'm very sure, as vast as you are, you know that they have done a lot to honor the respect they give the Jewish people who were affected. In this context, can we be able to equate the treatment of the Jewish people to the Benin people? Because when you see the glaring inequities between the way they are treated, you realize that it is solely based, these questions, these decisions of legal, moral, and ethical process is based on racial and connotation. So what can we do to go past that issue? Because if the Benin people had been treated like the Jews, I don't have the facts. I mean, not that I don't have the fact, but I have the idea that there is a wild restitution by the German government, by the British government too, and the American government. They all work hand in hand. They are all European countries. So why would the African issue be different from the Holocaust issue? Because when you when you take a look at the Holocaust issue and take a look at what they did in Benin, I don't see any difference. Why would one race be taken seriously and then the decision of legal and moral or ethical process or policy decide where we stand.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sunday, for joining us from the States. So let me be very clear about this whole thing about what I'm trying to say about moral and ethical versus legal, in case I'm not being absolutely clear. Morality changes, ethics change in all societies at all times. They're constantly fluid. What is moral and ethical in one society today would have been, perhaps immoral 100 years ago, and vice versa. And what we see in history is that law lags behind, I would suggest, morality and ethics, but it tends to catch up with it. So I'm certainly not saying that the legal route is closed forever. It may well be open one day. At this point in time, it seems that morals and ethics are the strongest weapons that the Edo have at their disposal. How do we know that laws change and they catch up with ethics? Well, the issue of Holocaust art looted by the Nazis is a very powerful example. I think it took until 1995, so that's 40 years after Adolf Hitler was toppled, that there was a big conference in Washington and a determination to do something about it across the Western world. And I think here in the UK, don't quote me on this, but I think the law didn't actually change. It was under Tony Blair's government. Was it 2004, 2006, 7? So it took time, but the law got there in the end.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So we have one more panelist today before we end today's program. We have been here for almost 2 hours now. Mr. Samson, Chief Samson Esoba. Go ahead, sir. Please, before you ask your question, introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. Thank you. We can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've done so. Thank you, my fellow panelists, and thank you, Barnaby Phillips. I sincerely want to thank you for taking time to join us in this program today. My names are Chief William Efosa Samson Ezoba. I live in Massachusetts, and I'm the Global Director of Edulite Industrial Developmental Partners Limited. My question will look like, first, let me thank my people. I want to thank the Edo people. I also want to thank the palace for the kind of unity, understanding that we've grown, coming up with this kind of historical background, where today, as we sat down here, reading and learning from each other, it's just like somebody telling you that your innocent father was beaten, arrested, humiliated, stolen from. After much later, they are telling you, oh, it was innocent. Even when some of the things stolen were supposed to be given, they are still asking you, you need to know the law that will make you have them back. Any way they look at it, it was the intention that brought not you, the other Philip, to Benin, that has continued to sour the story to this day. But our pride as a people is that anywhere you look at history, knowing that Benin is the cradle of black civilization, we are the first people to face them on with whatever they came with, and they thought they've destroyed the kingdom. We are still there today, and all we need to do now is, like what the second last speaker said, is to beg those who are doing this negotiation that it's not about what we can get from those who rip off our benefits. It's about bringing those spirituality back to where they took them from first. Because we can carve another one, but those other ones cannot replace the reason why the traditional institution is interested in this. So now that we still have them, let them bring them to the original place. Let us benefit, let us reclaim our spirituality. Then if they want for commercial purpose, they can also negotiate. We still have the craft to do the commercial purposes. Because the reason why it's interesting to everybody is that Historians know that when you people visited our various collection centers today, there are minds that is unexplainable to you people that you are interested in. And those power has brought all the technologies in the world. So please, we would like to have our things back. And anyhow they bring it, the Oba will know what to do. The second one is that I want the British or whoever these things are with to know that after 1897, whatever they have there brought them development. If somebody travel from the United States like myself to Britain or go to Washington or even go to Museum of Art and Fine Art here in Boston, the income they are going to get from me create employment, create value to those institutions. So with whatever they store for us, they've traded with them. It has brought development, it has brought awareness to them. Why not for once let them bring them back to us so that we can also have visitors in our country that can develop Benin, develop Nigeria, develop West Africa, because those things come. People may want to come and see how they now look like, where they originally took them from. So I want to be of the school of thought that whether it takes them 100 more years to bring it, we are more interested in the originality of the ones they took to be returned back. Then when they come, by the special grace of God, I do know that they will be developed. Then the question I have for you is that, why you spend so much time and money doing all this research work? Why did you choose to join us as for this? Do you have a reason why you are doing what you did? Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah, you know, in answer to the first part, you know, well, maybe in answer to the second part as well. You know, I've described the world as it is, not as I would like it to be. I would love it if we lived in a world where tourists from all over the world went to Benin City and saw all of Edo culture, you know, in its place of origin, and we could share and learn from each other in that regard. Why did I take so much time and trouble over this story? Well, you know, it's an extraordinary story. It's a story of great injustice. And I'm a storyteller. I'm a journalist. It's a story that had to be told. It's a story that I wanted British people to know more about, because inevitably the book is, you know, read primarily here in Britain. It's a story that comes from my heart. As a journalist, you set out to try and give a voice to the voiceless, as it were. It certainly wasn't. You know, it was. I took unpaid leave. It was a struggle to do it, but it's immensely rewarding. It's very, very, very satisfying. And like anything you do in life that is enriching, not in a financial way, but in a moral or spiritual way, if you like, you meet some wonderful people and make some great new friends along the way. And to that extent, today is part of that process.
Thank you for that answer. And I want to say that the ancestor that is guiding us in Benin will also guide you, knowing that you have a genuine love for us.
Of art law. And he would be able to answer some of these legal questions. And I'll suggest maybe next time we get together, I have his contacts, we bring him on, because I think he could have shed light. Let me show you. I've got his book here. Hang on a second. I found this is a book which only recently came out, and I found it very, very helpful. I don't know if you can all see it. Restitution: The Return of Cultural Artifacts, Alexander Herman. And he talks in very clear terms about what is possible in legal terms or not. And you know, all I can say is that I'm primarily a journalist covering this. It would be fascinating to report on such a test case. It would be fascinating to follow the Edo people's campaign for compensation as well for what happened in 1897. I will carry on watching that process and reporting on that process with interest, but I'm not the legal expert on what the potential for success is there under UK law. I'd suggest you would know more than I would in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Any other question before we end today's presentation? Any other question? Okay. Thank you.
I think he should invite us for his naming for the name, for the Adaze honorary. He should invite us for the naming ceremony according to the Benin laws and customs. Congratulations, Adaze Barnaby Phillips.
Thank you. I'm greatly honored by my title, and I hope, well, it would be wonderful if we can hold the ceremony in Benin City in the not too distant future.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Please, a very quick question for Philip, and that would be my last question. It's a very tricky question. Philip, I know you are aware of, though he's no longer a minister, former minister, Oliver Dowden. He said, make it clear, the British position regarding the artifacts, that they so love the artifacts, and under no circumstances will they return the Benin artifacts. So, a very provocative statement. It hurts us with the Edo people, and it goes deep into our bones. Why did they make such a statement? Is that really the position of the British government?
Okay. No, thank you, Mike. Thank you. I saw the statement. And look, I'm speaking now as a journalist. I'm speaking as someone who follows the process. I'm giving you my best analysis.
Right.
And yes, that is the position of the British Conservative government. And in fact, you rightly said that he's the former Culture Secretary. You might have seen the current Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorris. I think she is possibly even more hardline. She's certainly on the right wing of the Conservative Party in this regard. And so, this I think is the unfortunate thing from the point of view of the Edo. In the political terms, the government we have in the United Kingdom at the moment is not sympathetic. Now, that doesn't mean it controls everything. It doesn't control what the University of Aberdeen does. It doesn't control what Cambridge University does. It doesn't control what municipal museums do in Bristol, in Newcastle. You can expect more restitution. It does control what are called the national collections, and primarily in this case, of course, we're talking about the British Museum. It also controls the Victorian Albert Museum, which doesn't pertain to the Edo, but which also has lots of very contested items in it. All I would say, and I guess maybe this is to answer something that Patricia was bringing up from New York earlier as well, is that politics in this country are fluid. We have a Conservative government at the moment. It had what seemed to be an impregnable majority. That might change. We don't know when we'll have a next election, and we don't know what will come out of it, and we don't know what the politics of it will be. But nothing is forever.
Thank you. On this note, before I finish my last statement, is that now I just put this question so that my Edo people in the panel should know where we stand. That look, these things are not going to come without we fighting. It's just what the question my sister asked before, Mr. Basoge, if our voice is loud enough. Our voice is not even mentioned, not to talk of being loud. We Edo people, I'm happy now. I think after this, sister, you will give me the contact of everybody here. I'm happy to have Ogeriaki, who is a legal expert on this aspect. We Edo people, I always say, we have to do our work. We have to sing our song. We have to fight our fight. If we think the British government will one day say, okay, spiritually you are giving artifacts back. I'm not very good in that aspect. I'm not very superstitious. I believe we should mark pressure. No physical fight, no violence. We should put pressure as we've been doing campaigning with 2019 is when we started the first open air protest in Germany. We should start doing this. wherever, we should come together as people. Bako provided the platform for everyone. I invited a few people to go in there. My sister, Basoge is a member, Okoro is a member. Let all of us join together. There is nothing, as Philip said before, that is impossible. But if we don't shout like the Namibia people, they're not going to listen. Namibia people, the German government offered them 30 million. They replied to the German that it's an insult, and the German government put it to 1.4 billion US dollars. So please, we should work together and bring our artifacts back home. Thank you very much. That is my last statement for today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all. And any other question? If not, we're going to say bye to everyone for today. Barnaby Phillips, thank you so much. I hope you will come back to this program next time. If you have any research, any new topic about the Benin artifacts, please come and update us. Like what I said earlier, that this platform is for us to do a follow-up with some of the researchers, on Benin artifacts, so that we can update us. Majority of us don't even know what is going on with Benin artifacts. We know that the British people looted Benin artifacts during the 1897 expedition, but the whereabouts of these artifacts, majority of the Edo citizens are not cognizant of what is going on with the artifacts. That is why I created this platform where we can bring some facilitators, some researchers to update us about what is going on with Benin artifacts and the restitution as well. Thank you so much. We appreciate this presentation. And I will say thank you to all my panelists today. Thank you all. It was a wonderful session. Thank you, thank you. Wawesi. Admiral Barnaby Phillips, we have got a title today. Yes, take it back to United Kingdom. Take it back.
Thank you, Webster.
Thank you very much.
Admiral Phillips, one more for you. In Edo language, we say Owese. Can you say that?
Owese, thank you very much.
Yes.
No, thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.